The streets of Chicago hummed with the rhythm of life, cars honking, children laughing in playgrounds, and the chatter of neighbors exchanging pleasantries. But in a modest apartment, nestled in the heart of the city, a storm was brewing unseen by the world. Laura Bennett, a single mother and dedicated nurse, fought daily battles to balance her demanding job and her vibrant, imaginative 8-year-old son, Elliot. To outsiders, they appeared as an ordinary family living a quiet life. But behind closed doors, subtle cracks began to form in their world, growing wider with each passing day. It started small. Elliot's laughter, once infectious and uncontainable, had grown softer. His boundless energy now seemed tinged with hesitation. Laura's instincts whispered that something was wrong, but the chaos of her life drowned out those warnings. She didn't know that her trust had been misplaced. She didn't know that Elliot's radiant world had begun to dim. As the pieces began to fall apart, Laura was left to uncover a truth so dark it would shake her to her core, a truth that threatened not just her child, but the fragile bonds of trust that held them together. Laura Bennett juggled a grocery bag on her hip as she fumbled for her apartment keys. The Chicago evening buzzed outside, a mix of car horns and distant laughter. She finally managed to unlock the door, stepping into their modest 2-bedroom apartment. "Elliot, I'm home," Laura called out, her voice tired but warm. From the living room, an enthusiastic "Mom" echoed back. Elliot bounded out to meet her, his unruly curls bouncing with each step. His arms wrapped around her in a tight hug, and Laura couldn't help but laugh, dropping the bag to hug him back. "How was your day, little man?" she asked, ruffling his hair. Elliot's eyes sparkled as he launched into a tale about his school day. His science experiment, a game of tag gone hilariously wrong, and the latest escapades of his imaginary superhero, Captain Braveheart. Listening to him, Laura felt a pang of guilt. She hated that her job at the hospital meant she couldn't spend as much time with him as she wanted. The long hours, the double shifts, they were all for him, but it didn't make the separation any easier. Later that evening, as Laura chopped vegetables for dinner, a soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Mrs. Caldwell, their elderly neighbor. She peeked in, her kind face creased with a smile. "Laura, dear," she began, her voice warm, "I wanted to talk to you about Elliot. I know how busy you are, and I heard you've been looking for a steady babysitter." Laura wiped her hands on a towel, curious. "Yes, I've been using different sitters, but it's been hit or miss." "Why?" Mrs. Caldwell's smile widened. "Well, Grace Mitchell just moved in upstairs. She's wonderful, such a sweet young woman, and she has years of experience. She's been looking for families to work with. I thought you might want to meet her." Laura hesitated. She had always been cautious about who she left Elliot with. "I'd love to meet her. Do you think she'd be open to talking tonight?" As if summoned, a soft knock sounded at the door. Mrs. Caldwell turned with a knowing smile. Speak of the angel. Grace Mitchell stepped inside, her presence immediately disarming. In her early 30s, she had a kind, open face, framed by chestnut brown hair tied neatly back. Her smile was warm, her handshake firm, yet friendly. "It's so nice to meet you, Laura," Grace said, her voice soft but confident. She knelt slightly to meet Elliot's eye level. "And you must be Elliot." Elliot hesitated, clutching Laura's leg as he peeked at Grace. Laura gave him a reassuring nudge. "Say hi, sweetheart." "Hi," he said shyly, his voice barely above a whisper. Grace didn't push. "I hear you're a superhero fan. Who's your favorite?" Elliot's eyes lit up at the question, his shyness momentarily forgotten. "Captain Braveheart," Grace chuckled, glancing up at Laura. "He sounds like someone I'd like to meet." Laura smiled, her initial wariness easing. Maybe, just maybe, this could work. Over the next half hour, they discussed schedules, references, and expectations. Grace came across as competent and genuine, leaving Laura cautiously optimistic. When Grace left, Laura knelt down beside Elliot. "What do you think of Grace, honey? Would you be okay if she stayed with you while I'm at work?" Elliot's brow furrowed in thought. Before he nodded, "I guess. She seems nice." Laura hugged him tightly, her heart swelling with relief. For the first time in a while, she felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps Grace was the answer to their prayers, a stable presence who could care for Elliot when she couldn't. But as Laura kissed Elliot goodnight, she noticed something she couldn't quite put her finger on in his expression. A fleeting shadow of unease that vanished as quickly as it appeared. It was the first faint warning of the storm to come. The next few weeks brought a semblance of stability to Laura and Elliot's lives. Grace arrived promptly every morning with her calm smile and reassuring demeanor. Laura, desperate to believe she had found someone reliable, clung to the hope that her worries had finally been laid to rest. Elliot, however, seemed less enthusiastic. At first, Laura dismissed his reserved behavior as a normal adjustment. Change was always hard for kids, wasn't it? But the signs were small and persistent. Elliot's once exuberant chatter after school waned, and he started retreating into his room more often than not. One evening, as Laura stirred a pot of spaghetti sauce, she noticed Elliot sitting unusually quiet at the kitchen table. He usually doodled while she cooked, his drawings brimming with superheroes and colorful scenes of adventure. But this time, his crayon hovered uncertainly over the page. "What's on your mind, sweetheart?" Laura asked, trying to keep her voice light. Elliot hesitated, then looked up with a forced smile. "Nothing, Mom. Just drawing." Laura's eyes flicked to the paper. It was a strange image, a shadowy figure with sharp angles that loomed over a small child. It sent a shiver down her spine. "Who's that?" she asked, pointing to the figure. Elliot shrugged, avoiding her gaze. "Just a monster," he mumbled, then quickly flipped to a blank page. Laura didn't press. Kids had wild imaginations, she told herself. Still, the image lingered in her mind long after Elliot had gone to bed. The changes in Elliot became more pronounced as days turned into weeks. The boy who once bounded out of bed each morning now dragged his feet, his shoulders slumped as he got ready for school. His usual excitement over his favorite shows or books seemed dulled. Laura tried to dismiss her growing unease. Maybe it was just a phase. Kids had phases, didn't they? And yet, the nagging feeling persisted. One evening, Grace stayed a little longer than usual. She had brought cookies she claimed to have baked for Elliot. And while he thanked her politely, he didn't touch them. Instead, he sat at the edge of the couch, his small frame tense. Laura watched the interaction closely. Grace's voice was friendly, her tone sweet, but something about it felt off. A subtle edge, a faint trace of condescension. "You know, Elliot," Grace said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "it's okay if you don't understand everything in your homework. Not everyone's good at math." Elliot's cheeks flushed, and he looked down at his hands. Laura frowned. The comment seemed innocent, but it pricked at her, like a tiny splinter she couldn't ignore. "Elliot's doing great in school," Laura interjected, her tone sharper than she intended. "He's just shy about asking for help sometimes." Grace laughed lightly, brushing off the tension. "Oh, of course, he's a bright kid. I was just teasing." But as Grace packed up her things and left, Laura noticed Elliot quietly slip the untouched cookies into the trash. That night, as Laura tucked Elliot into bed, she leaned down to kiss his forehead. You okay, baby? She asked softly. Elliot nodded, but his eyes darted away. Yeah, I'm fine, he said quickly. Are you sure? Laura pressed, brushing his hair back. You've been awfully quiet lately. Is everything okay with Grace? Elliot hesitated, his small hands clutching the edge of his blanket. She's nice, he said after a moment. But his voice lacked conviction. Laura's stomach tightened. You can tell me anything, Elliot. You know that, right? He nodded again, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. As she left his room, closing the door gently behind her, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The next morning, as Laura rushed to get ready for work, Elliot sat quietly at the kitchen table. Grace arrived promptly at 7:30, her smile as polished as ever. Good morning, Laura. Good morning, Elliot, she chirped. Elliot mumbled a reply, keeping his eyes fixed on the table. Laura noticed but didn't have time to dwell on it. She was already running late. Elliot's been a little off lately, Laura said as she grabbed her bag. Maybe he's just tired, but if anything seems wrong, please call me. Grace nodded, her expression sympathetic. Of course. He's probably just adjusting to all the changes. Don't worry, Laura. I'll take good care of him. Laura forced a smile and kissed Elliot on the head before leaving. As she walked to her car, the nagging feeling in her chest grew stronger. Later that evening, Laura sat on the couch with Elliot, trying to coax him out of his shell. She offered to play his favorite board game, even suggested they order pizza instead of eating leftovers. But Elliot seemed distracted, answering her questions with brief nods or shrugs. Sweetheart, Laura said gently, placing a hand on his back. I need you to tell me if something's bothering you. Are you having trouble at school? Is someone being mean to you? Elliot shook his head, his curls bouncing. No, Mom. Everything's fine. But Laura wasn't convinced. She watched him retreat to his room, her heart heavy with worry. One night, as Laura folded laundry, Elliot's voice called out from his room. Mom? She walked in to find him sitting on his bed, his legs crossed and his favorite stuffed dinosaur clutched in his hands. What is it, honey? She asked, sitting beside him. Elliot hesitated, then whispered, I don't like Grace. Laura's heart skipped a beat. Why not? He fidgeted with the dinosaur's tail, his voice barely audible. She's mean. Sometimes. Laura felt a wave of emotions, confusion, anger, guilt. What do you mean, sweetheart? Did she say something to you? Elliot shrugged, avoiding her eyes. She just makes me feel bad. Like I'm stupid. Laura's chest tightened. Elliot, listen to me. You are not stupid. You're the smartest, most amazing kid I know. Elliot gave her a small smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. Okay, he murmured. As she tucked him in and kissed his forehead, Laura's mind raced. What had seemed like small, isolated incidents were starting to add up. Something wasn't right, and she couldn't ignore it any longer. That night, Laura lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Her thoughts swirled with worry and doubt. Was she overreacting? Or was her gut telling her something she needed to hear? One thing was clear. She needed answers. The sun streamed through the apartment window, but the warmth did little to ease the chill that settled over Laura's heart. She sat at the breakfast table with a cup of coffee in her hands, her mind racing. Elliot's confession the night before had shattered the fragile sense of peace she had tried so hard to maintain. Elliot sat across from her, methodically pushing his scrambled eggs around his plate. His usual chatter about superheroes and school was absent, replaced by an uncomfortable silence. Laura studied him, her motherly instincts kicking in. Elliot, she began softly, about what you said last night. Can you tell me more? Why does Grace make you feel bad? Elliot froze, his fork hovering midair. "I don't know, Mom," he mumbled, his eyes fixed on his plate. "She just does." Laura's chest tightened. She wanted to press for more details, but she didn't want to push him too hard. "Okay," she said gently. "Just remember, you can always talk to me. About anything?" Elliot nodded, but the way he avoided her gaze spoke volumes. Later that day, as Laura folded laundry, her phone buzzed. It was Mrs. Caldwell, her elderly neighbor. Laura picked up the call, grateful for the distraction. "Good afternoon, Laura," Mrs. Caldwell said, in her usual cheery tone. "I was just calling to check in. How's that babysitter of yours doing?" Laura hesitated. "Grace? She's fine, I guess." There was a pause on the other end. "You know, dear, I don't mean to pry," Mrs. Caldwell said carefully, "but I've heard some concerning things about her from other families she's worked for." Laura's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" "Well," Mrs. Caldwell said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "I ran into a friend of mine who knows Grace. She mentioned something about Grace leaving her last job under unusual circumstances." "What kind of circumstances?" Laura pressed, her grip tightening on the phone. Mrs. Caldwell hesitated. "I don't have all the details, but it sounded like there was some tension with the family. You might want to look into it, just to be safe." Laura thanked Mrs. Caldwell and ended the call, her mind buzzing with worry. Was it just gossip, or was there something more to Grace than she'd realized? That evening, as Laura helped Elliot with his homework, she noticed faint bruises on his arms. Her breath caught in her throat. "Honey," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "what happened here?" Elliot glanced down at the marks and quickly pulled his sleeve down. "It's nothing, Mom. I got them playing at school." Laura frowned. "Are you sure? Did someone hurt you?" "No," Elliot said quickly. "It was just an accident." Laura wanted to believe him, but a seed of doubt had already been planted. The bruises, the withdrawn behavior, Mrs. Caldwell's warning. It all felt like pieces of a puzzle she couldn't quite put together. Unable to shake her growing unease, Laura decided to do some digging. That night, after putting Elliot to bed, she opened her laptop and began searching online for any information about Grace Mitchell. Her efforts yielded little at first. Grace's social media profiles were sparse, filled with generic photos and vague updates. But as Laura dug deeper, she stumbled upon a discussion thread on a local parenting forum. One post caught her eye. "Does anyone know a Grace Mitchell? She used to babysit for us, but we had to let her go. There were issues. If you're thinking about hiring her, proceed with caution." Laura's stomach churned as she read through the replies. While none of them provided concrete details, the recurring theme of dissatisfaction and unease was hard to ignore. The next morning, Laura debated whether to confront Grace directly. Part of her wanted to give the babysitter the benefit of the doubt, but another part couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. In the end, she decided to trust her instincts. "Elliot," she said, as she dropped him off at school, "I want you to tell me right away if Grace does or says anything that makes you uncomfortable. Okay?" Elliot nodded, but his silence spoke volumes. Laura kissed him on the forehead and watched him disappear into the school building, her heart heavy with worry. As the day went on, Laura's thoughts returned to the bruises on Elliot's arms. She replayed their conversation in her head, questioning every detail. Had he been telling the truth, or was he trying to protect her from something he didn't want to talk about? When she returned home that evening, she found herself scrutinizing every interaction between Elliot and Grace. The babysitter's cheerful demeanor seemed genuine enough, But there was something about the way she looked at Elliot, an almost imperceptible edge, that set Laura on edge. "Thank you, Grace," Laura said, as she handed her a check at the end of the evening. "Elliot and I really appreciate all your help." Grace smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Of course, Laura. I'm happy to help." As Grace left, Laura's unease deepened. That night, as Laura lay in bed, her thoughts raced. She knew she couldn't ignore the signs any longer. Whatever was happening, she needed to get to the bottom of it. The next morning, Laura went to an electronics store and purchased a small, discreet camera. She felt a pang of guilt as she installed it in the living room, angling it to capture as much of the space as possible. "This is for Elliot," she told herself, her hands trembling as she adjusted the camera. "I need to know the truth." As Laura watched Grace interact with Elliot over the next few days, she felt a knot of dread forming in her stomach. The footage revealed subtle but unmistakable moments of tension. Grace's smile faltering when Elliot hesitated to follow her instructions, her tone sharp when she thought no one was listening. One evening, Laura reviewed the footage from earlier that day. Her heart sank as she watched Grace grab Elliot's arm roughly, pulling him toward the couch. "Sit down," Grace snapped, her voice low but firm, "and stay there until I say you can move." Elliot's small frame trembled as he obeyed, his eyes wide with fear. Laura's hands clenched into fists as she watched. This wasn't just her imagination. Grace's behavior was crossing a line, and she couldn't let it continue. That night, Laura sat at the kitchen table, staring at the camera footage on her laptop. Her mind raced with questions. How could she have let this happen? How could she have missed the signs? She glanced toward Elliot's bedroom, where her son slept peacefully. "I'm going to fix this," she whispered. "I promise." The next morning dawned gray and overcast, the weather mirroring the heavy weight in Laura's chest. She had spent most of the night poring over the camera footage, her emotions swinging between disbelief and fury. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the fear on Elliot's face as Grace's harsh words echoed in her mind. Laura sat at the kitchen table, the memory card from the hidden camera clutched tightly in her hand. She knew she couldn't ignore what she had seen. Something had to be done. But how? Grace had been so carefully crafted as trustworthy, so perfect on the surface. Confronting her felt like stepping onto a battlefield without a clear plan. That afternoon, Laura picked Elliot up from school. He slid into the passenger seat, unusually quiet. Laura tried to muster a smile as she glanced at him. "How was your day, sweetie?" she asked. Elliot shrugged, staring out the window. "It was okay." Laura's heart ached. She knew the truth about why he had become so withdrawn. "Elliot," she said softly, "I've been thinking about what you told me. About Grace." Elliot stiffened, his small hands gripping the seatbelt. "Are you mad at me?" he whispered, his voice trembling. Laura's chest tightened. "Mad at you? Oh, honey, no. I could never be mad at you for telling me how you feel." Elliot hesitated before glancing up at her, his eyes wide and uncertain. "You believe me?" Laura reached over, gently squeezing his hand. "Of course I do. And I'm going to make sure you're safe. You don't have to be scared anymore." That evening, Laura sat down with her laptop, determined to gather everything she needed. She replayed the footage from the hidden camera, her stomach twisting with each new revelation. Grace's behavior wasn't overtly violent, but it was insidious. The way she called Elliot lazy and clumsy, in a sing-song voice, masking cruelty as playful teasing. The way she yanked his arm or forced him to sit in the corner for hours over the smallest mistakes. Laura's fury boiled over as she clicked through the files. How many other families had trusted this woman? How many children had endured this same treatment? Her resolve hardened. She wouldn't let this continue. But before she could act, she needed to confront Grace. The following morning, Laura invited Grace over, under the pretense of discussing scheduling. As she waited for Grace to arrive, her heart raced. She had rehearsed what she would say, but the thought of facing the babysitter filled her with dread. The doorbell rang, jolting her out of her thoughts. Laura opened the door to find Grace standing there, her usual warm smile in place. "Good morning, Laura," Grace said cheerfully. "You mentioned needing to talk?" Laura stepped aside, gesturing for her to come in. "Yes. Please have a seat." Grace sat down at the kitchen table, folding her hands neatly in her lap. Laura stayed standing, her arms crossed. "I want to talk about Elliot," Laura began, her voice steady despite the nerves fluttering in her stomach. "He's been acting differently since you started babysitting." Grace tilted her head, feigning concern. "Oh? What do you mean?" Laura pulled out her laptop, opening the folder containing the camera footage. She turned the screen toward Grace, her expression unyielding. "I installed a camera in the living room, and I saw how you've been treating him." For a split second, Grace's face faltered. Then she recovered, her smile turning icy. "I'm not sure what you're talking about." Laura clicked on a file, playing a clip of Grace yanking Elliot's arm as she berated him. The sound of her sharp voice filled the room. "You're so useless. Can't you do anything right?" Grace's expression hardened, the pretense of kindness slipping away. "He's a difficult child, Laura," she said, her tone defensive. "Sometimes you have to be firm with kids like him." Laura's voice rose, trembling with anger. "Firm? You call this firm? Yelling at him? Calling him names? Grabbing his arm like that? That's not discipline, Grace. It's abuse." Grace stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "You have no idea what you're talking about," she snapped. "Maybe if you were home more often, you'd understand how hard it is to deal with him." Laura took a step forward, her hands trembling. "Don't you dare try to blame this on me. I trusted you with my son, and you've been hurting him. Get out of my house, now." Grace's eyes narrowed, a chilling smile spreading across her face. "You'll regret this," she said quietly, before turning and walking out the door. After Grace left, Laura collapsed onto the couch, her hands shaking. She felt a rush of conflicting emotions, relief that she had finally confronted Grace, but also fear about what might happen next. Her phone buzzed, breaking her thoughts. She picked it up, expecting a message from work or a friend. Instead, it was a voicemail from an unknown number. "Laura Bennett," a deep, unfamiliar voice began. "I know what you're trying to do. Stop now, or you'll regret it." Laura's blood ran cold. Who was this, and how did they know about her confrontation with Grace? That night, Laura sat in the dim light of the living room, the voicemail playing over and over in her mind. She had planned to call the police after Grace left, but the cryptic message had thrown her off balance. What did it mean? Was Grace connected to something bigger than she had realized? She glanced toward Elliot's room, where her son was fast asleep. No matter what happened, she would protect him. But she needed help. Taking a deep breath, Laura picked up her phone and dialed 911. The dispatcher's calm voice steadied Laura's nerves as she explained the situation. "I have footage of my babysitter verbally and physically mistreating my son," she said, her voice shaking. "And I just received a threatening voicemail. We'll send an officer to your address immediately," the dispatcher assured her. As Laura hung up, she felt a mixture of fear and determination. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The police arrived within minutes, of Laura's 911 call. Their presence, while reassuring, filled the small apartment with a weight of seriousness that Laura couldn't ignore. Officer Ryan Keller and Detective Jordan Monroe introduced themselves with calm, steady voices that helped Laura keep her composure. As they settled into the living room, Laura handed over the memory card containing the hidden camera footage. "It's all here," she said, her voice trembling. "You'll see what she did to my son." Detective Monroe took the card, his sharp eyes narrowing slightly. "We'll review this immediately," he said, sliding it into a small evidence bag. "But you mentioned a voicemail as well?" Laura nodded, unlocking her phone. She played the message for the officers, the cryptic warning filling the air with an ominous chill. Officer Keller furrowed his brow. "Do you recognize the voice?" "No," Laura replied, her hands twisting in her lap. "I don't know who it could be." "We'll investigate this as a separate threat," Monroe assured her, his tone professional. "But let's focus on gathering evidence about Grace Mitchell first." The next day, Detective Monroe called Laura with an update. "We've started digging into Grace Mitchell's background," he said, "and it appears her credentials aren't as solid as she claimed." Laura's grip tightened on the phone. "What do you mean?" "She has a history of moving frequently," Monroe explained. "Several families she worked for in the past have reported issues, but none of the complaints ever led to charges." A chill ran down Laura's spine. "What kind of issues?" "Similar to what you've described. Harsh discipline, intimidation. But without concrete evidence, the cases never went anywhere." Laura's heart sank. How many children had suffered because no one had stopped her? Later that evening, as Laura sat at the kitchen table reviewing the detective's findings, her ex-husband Evan called. His name flashing on the screen gave her pause. It had been months since their last conversation. "Laura," Evan's voice came through the line, cautious but insistent. "I heard about what's going on. Mrs. Caldwell mentioned something when I ran into her at the grocery store." Laura sighed, pinching the bridge of her nose. "Evan, I don't need a lecture. I already feel awful." "That's not why I'm calling," he interrupted, his tone softening. "I want to help." Laura's instinctive response was to push him away, but something in his voice made her hesitate. "Why now?" she asked, her voice tinged with suspicion. "You've been distant for months, and now you suddenly want to get involved?" "I know. I haven't been there like I should have," Evan admitted. "But this is different. Uti, it's about Elliot. I just want to make sure he's safe." Laura hesitated, torn between her frustration with Evan and the possibility that he could genuinely support them. "If you're serious about helping, you'll need to work with me, not against me." "Of course," Evan said quickly. "Just tell me what you need." As the days passed, Laura noticed Elliot continuing to grapple with the emotional fallout of Grace's treatment. He had begun waking up in the middle of the night, plagued by nightmares that left him trembling. One evening, Laura found him huddled under his blankets, clutching his favorite stuffed dinosaur. "Elliot, sweetheart," she said gently, sitting beside him. "Did you have another bad dream?" He nodded, his big eyes glistening with unshed tears. "She was there, Mom. She was yelling at me, saying I was stupid." Laura's chest tightened. She pulled him close, stroking his hair. "It's okay, baby. She can't hurt you anymore." "But I didn't tell you sooner," he whispered, his voice quivering. "It's my fault." Laura's heart broke at his words. She cupped his face, making him look at her. "Elliot, listen to me. None of this is your fault. You're so brave for telling me the truth. I'm proud of you." Elliot sniffled, leaning into her embrace. "Really?" "Really," she assured him, her voice firm. "You're the bravest boy I know." Detective Monroe continued to unravel the threads of Grace's past, uncovering more alarming details. Grace's employment history was riddled with inconsistencies, and several families had moved away shortly after hiring her. It was clear she had been targeting vulnerable children, but the reason why remained elusive. One afternoon, Monroe visited Laura with an update. "We've identified a pattern," he explained, spreading a map across her kitchen table. Pins marked various cities and neighborhoods where Grace had lived. "She seems to focus on low-income families, particularly single parents." Laura's stomach churned. "But why? What does she gain from this?" Monroe hesitated. "We're not sure yet, but there's a possibility she's connected to a larger network. We've uncovered some financial transactions that don't add up." "What kind of network?" Laura asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Monroe's expression darkened. "We're looking into the possibility of child exploitation. It's not confirmed yet, but the signs are there." The revelation hit Laura like a punch to the gut. She had thought Grace's actions were the work of a cruel individual, but this suggested something far more sinister. Meanwhile, Evan began to show signs of genuine support. He attended meetings with Monroe, helped Laura organize Elliot's medical records, and even offered to watch Elliot while Laura dealt with the legal proceedings. "I want to prove that I can be a good father," Evan said one evening as they sat in the living room. "I know I've let you both down, but I'm trying to make things right." Laura eyed him warily. "This isn't about us, Evan. It's about Elliot. If you're doing this to rebuild our relationship, you're missing the point." Evan nodded, his expression earnest. "I know, and I'm okay with that. I just want to do what's best for him." Laura couldn't deny that having Evan's help made the situation more manageable, but she remained cautious, unsure if his intentions were purely selfless. As the investigation gained traction, Laura began sharing her story with a local support group for parents. The group became a lifeline for her, a place where she could express her fears and frustrations without judgment. One evening, as Laura recounted the details of Grace's actions, another mother spoke up. "I had a babysitter like that once," she did, her voice trembling. "I wish I had spoken out sooner." Her words struck a chord with Laura. For too long, she had let her guilt silence her. But now she realized the importance of using her voice, not just for Elliot, but for other families who might be at risk. By the end of the chapter, Laura's resolve had solidified. She would do whatever it took to protect Elliot and uncover the truth about Grace's network. The road ahead was daunting, but she was no longer afraid to face it. As she tucked Elliot into bed that night, she kissed his forehead and whispered, "We're going to get through this, sweetheart. Together." Elliot smiled sleepily, his small hand clutching hers. "I love you, Mom." "I love you too," Laura replied, her heart swelling with determination. The small community center buzzed with murmurs as neighbors gathered for the monthly meeting. Usually these gatherings were quiet affairs, filled with discussions about building maintenance and local events. But tonight was different. Laura stood near the back of the room, clutching a folder of evidence with trembling hands. Detective Jordan Monroe had encouraged her to attend and present what she had uncovered about Grace Mitchell. Her heart pounded as she scanned the room. Grace sat near the front, her polished demeanor intact. She wore a crisp blouse and a calm expression, chatting amiably with Mrs. Caldwell. If Laura didn't know better, she might have doubted her own accusations, but the memory of Elliot's fear, the bruises on his arms, and the horrifying footage played vividly in her mind. The meeting began with routine updates. Laura barely heard the words as the community president spoke. Her pulse quickened when the agenda shifted to the open floor segment. "This is it," Monroe murmured beside her. "It's time." Laura stood, gripping the edge of the table for support. "Excuse me," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I need to address something that concerns all of us." Heads turned toward her, and the room fell silent. Grace's gaze locked onto Laura, her smile faltering for a brief moment before she regained her composure. "I want to talk about Grace Mitchell," Laura began, her voice growing steadier. "I trusted her to care for my son, Elliot. But what I discovered about her behavior shocked me." Gasps rippled through the room as Laura pulled out a laptop and projected the hidden camera footage onto a blank wall. The grainy video showed Grace yanking Elliot's arm, berating him, and forcing him to stand in a corner for hours. "This is what she did to my son," Laura said, her voice breaking. "And I've since learned that Elliot isn't the only child she's hurt." The room erupted in whispers, and Grace's calm facade began to crack. She stood abruptly, her voice sharp. "This is outrageous. You're trying to ruin my reputation with baseless accusations." "Baseless?" Laura shot back, pointing to the footage. "This is your own behavior caught on camera, Grace. Deny it all you want, but the proof is right here." Mrs. Caldwell's hand flew to her mouth. "Grace, is this true?" she asked, her voice shaking. Grace's expression shifted, her features hardening. "I don't have to explain myself to anyone here," she said coldly. But her tone betrayed a hint of unease. Detective Monroe stepped forward. "Actually, you do. Miss Mitchell, you're under investigation for child abuse and other potential charges. You should be careful about what you say." The tension in the room was palpable as Grace crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing. "You think you've figured me out?" she sneered. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." Laura felt a chill run down her spine. "What does that mean?" Grace's lips curled into a smirk. "I'm not the only one. There are others, people much higher up, who wouldn't appreciate this kind of attention. You think you've won, but you're just scratching the surface." Detective Monroe's eyes sharpened. "If you have information about a larger operation, now's the time to cooperate." Grace laughed, a bitter sound that echoed through the room. "You'll never get to them. They'll bury you before you even try." As Monroe signaled his fellow officers to move in, Grace's bravado faltered. She stepped back, her hands trembling slightly as they cuffed her. "You're making a mistake," she hissed. "You don't know what you're getting into." Laura watched in silence as they led Grace away, a mixture of relief and fear churning in her stomach. She had exposed Grace, but her cryptic warnings about a larger network lingered like a dark cloud. Over the next few days, the community buzzed with the aftermath of the meeting. Neighbors who had once trusted Grace avoided Laura, unsure of how to process the revelations. Mrs. Caldwell, however, approached Laura with tears in her eyes. "I'm so sorry," she said. "I had no idea what Grace was capable of. If I had known, I never would have recommended her." Laura placed a comforting hand on the older woman's shoulder. "It's not your fault. Grace fooled all of us." Meanwhile, Detective Monroe intensified the investigation, digging into Grace's cryptic claims. He called Laura with updates, each more unsettling than the last. "We've found financial ties between Grace and a company that operates under multiple aliases," Monroe explained. "It seems to be a front for a child exploitation ring." Laura's stomach turned. "So, she wasn't acting alone?" "No," Monroe confirmed. "And if what Grace said is true, this network could be much larger than we initially thought." In the midst of the chaos, Laura focused on helping Elliot heal. She took him to his therapy sessions with Dr. Rachel Turner, who introduced him to art therapy. Elliot began drawing superheroes, figures with capes and shields, who protected others from harm. One evening, as they sat together at the dining table, Elliot showed Laura a new drawing. "This one is you, Mom," he said, holding up a picture of a caped woman standing in front of a small boy. Laura's throat tightened. "Me? Why?" "Because you saved me," Elliot said simply, his eyes shining with love. "You're my hero." Tears filled Laura's eyes as she pulled him into a hug. "And you're mine, sweetheart." The chapter ends with Laura standing at her apartment window, looking out at the city lights. She felt a mix of hope and apprehension. Exposing Grace had been just the beginning. Now she was determined to uncover the full truth about the network Grace had hinted at. For Elliot, and for all the other children who needed protection, Laura vowed to keep fighting. The following weeks were a blur of appointments, paperwork, and quiet moments, filled with both relief and lingering fear. Grace was behind bars, but the damage she had caused was still visible in Elliot's eyes, eyes that once sparkled with mischief and wonder, now clouded with apprehension. Laura knew that healing would take time, and she was determined to give her son all the support he needed. Dr. Rachel Turner's office was a warm, welcoming space, filled with colorful artwork and shelves stacked with books and toys. A large window let in natural light, casting a calming glow over the room. Elliot sat on a small couch, clutching a superhero figurine tightly in his hand. Laura sat nearby, offering a reassuring smile. "Hi, Elliot," Dr. Turner said gently, sitting on a stool across from him. "I'm so glad you're here. Your mom told me you like superheroes. Who's your favorite?" Elliot hesitated, glancing at Laura before replying. "Superman?" Dr. Turner nodded with enthusiasm. "Superman's amazing. Do you know what I love about him? He's not just strong. He's brave. Even when things are scary, he finds a way to help others. That's a lot like you." Elliot's grip on the figurine loosened slightly, and Laura noticed a flicker of pride in his expression. Dr. Turner handed him a blank sheet of paper and a set of markers. "How about we draw your superhero today? You can make him or her look however you want." Elliot nodded and began sketching, his small hands moving purposefully across the paper. Laura watched from her chair, her heart swelling with hope. For the first time in weeks, Elliot seemed engaged in something other than his fear. Over the next few sessions, Elliot's drawings became a powerful outlet for his emotions. He created a superhero named Braveheart, a figure with a cape that glowed in the dark and a shield that could block any harm. Dr. Turner used the drawings to help Elliot process his feelings. "Braveheart has been through a lot," Dr. Turner said during one session, pointing to a drawing. "But look at how strong they are now. Do you think Braveheart ever feels scared?" Elliot nodded, his eyes fixed on the picture. "Sometimes." "And what does Braveheart do when they feel scared?" Dr. Turner asked gently. They ask for help," Elliot replied, after a moment of thought. "And then they remember they're strong." Dr. Turner smiled. "That's exactly right. It's okay to feel scared, Elliot. Asking for help is one of the bravest things anyone can do." Laura felt tears prick her eyes as she listened. Watching Elliot slowly reclaim his confidence was both heartbreaking and uplifting. Each session seemed to bring him a step closer to the vibrant, curious boy she knew and loved. At home, Laura worked hard to create a stable, nurturing environment for Elliot. She adjusted her work schedule to spend more time with him, using her savings to make up for the lost income. Their days followed a comforting rhythm. Breakfast together, therapy sessions, afternoons spent at the park, or reading books on the couch. One evening, while tucking Elliot into bed, Laura noticed him clutching his superhero cape, a recent gift she had given him to symbolize his bravery. "Do you feel like a superhero tonight?" she asked, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. Elliot nodded. Yeah, but sometimes I still get scared. That's okay, Laura said softly. Even superheroes feel scared sometimes. The important thing is that you're safe now, and I'm always here for you. Elliot reached up and wrapped his arms around her neck. I love you, Mom. Laura hugged him tightly, her heart full of love and determination. I love you too, sweetheart. Always. While Elliot attended his therapy sessions, Laura began attending a support group for parents of children who had experienced trauma. The group met weekly in the same community center where Laura had confronted Grace. The room was filled with parents from all walks of life, their faces etched with worry, pain, and occasionally hope. During her first session, Laura listened as others shared their stories. One mother described her struggles with guilt after realizing her child had been bullied at school. A father spoke about the anger he felt toward himself for not protecting his daughter from an abusive teacher. When it was Laura's turn to speak, her voice trembled. I trusted someone with my son, and they hurt him, she said, tears streaming down her face. I feel like I failed him. A woman across the circle leaned forward, her expression kind. You didn't fail him, she said firmly. You stood up for him. You're here now, doing everything you can to help him heal. That's what matters. The words brought Laura a sense of relief she hadn't realized she needed. Over time, the group became a source of strength for her, a place where she could share her fears and triumphs without judgment. As the weeks turned into months, Elliot began to show signs of progress. He started laughing at jokes, playing with his toys, and even asking to visit the park. One sunny afternoon, he surprised Laura by climbing to the top of the jungle gym, a feat he hadn't attempted since before the ordeal with Grace. Look, Mom, he called down, his face beaming with pride. I'm on top. Laura cheered, her heart swelling with pride. You're amazing, Elliot, my brave little superhero. That night, as they snuggled on the couch, Elliot looked up at her. Mom, do you think I'll ever stop feeling scared? Laura kissed the top of his head. I think you will, sweetheart. But even if you don't, it's okay. Being brave doesn't mean you're never scared. It means you keep going, even when you are. Elliot nodded, his small hand reaching for hers. Then, I'll keep going. Through their shared journey of healing, Laura and Elliot's bond grew stronger than ever. They talked openly about their feelings, shared silly moments, and celebrated small victories together. Laura found herself rediscovering the joys of motherhood, no longer weighed down by guilt or fear. One evening, as they prepared dinner together, Elliot turned to Laura with a thoughtful expression. Mom, do you think Braveheart would be proud of me? Laura knelt down to his level, her eyes filled with love. Sweetheart, Braveheart would be so proud of you. And so am I. Elliot grinned, his face lighting up with the confidence Laura had feared might never return. In that moment, she knew they were on the right path, one step closer to leaving the shadows behind. The relief of having Grace out of their lives was short-lived, as Laura found herself drawn deeper into a web of alarming revelations. While Elliot continued his journey toward healing, Laura's determination to protect her son, and others like him, grew stronger. She resolved to uncover the full extent of the danger that had lurked so close to her family. One afternoon, as Laura was preparing lunch, her phone buzzed. The screen displayed Detective Jordan Monroe's name. Laura's chest tightened as she answered. Ms. Bennett. Monroe's calm yet serious tone came through. I wanted to update you on our investigation. Laura wiped her hands on a dish towel, trying to steady her voice. Have you found something? Yes, Monroe said. We've uncovered evidence suggesting Grace Mitchell was part of a larger network. It appears they specifically target vulnerable families in urban areas, using babysitting as a cover to exploit children. Laura's heart sank. A network? Are you saying there are more like her? Monroe's silence was answer enough. Finally, he added, "We believe this group profits from manipulating families and exploiting children emotionally and financially." Grace wasn't acting alone. Laura's grip on the phone tightened. "What can I do to help?" Monroe hesitated. "We'll need your help in spreading awareness. We're planning a community meeting to inform other parents and gather more potential witnesses." "I'll be there," Laura said firmly, her resolve hardening. Laura threw herself into the preparations for the community meeting, working closely with Monroe and a local advocacy group. Flyers were distributed, and notices were posted in schools, libraries, and community centers. Laura also reached out to her support group, encouraging the other parents to attend and share their experiences. During one late-night planning session, Monroe revealed more about the group's tactics. "They exploit trust," he explained, spreading documents across the table. "People like Grace present themselves as ideal caregivers, charming, experienced, and well-recommended. They often fabricate glowing references and prey on parents who are overwhelmed or struggling." Laura felt a surge of anger. How can they do this to children? To families? Monroe's expression softened. "Because they think they can get away with it. But we're going to make sure they don't." Amidst the chaos of organizing the meeting, Evan, Laura's ex-husband, made an unexpected reappearance. He arrived unannounced at her apartment one evening, holding a box of Elliot's favorite comic books. "I heard about what happened," he said, his usual bravado replaced by genuine concern. "I want to help." Laura crossed her arms, skeptical. "Why now, Evan? Where were you when we needed you?" Evan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know I messed up, but I want to make things right. For Elliot." After a long pause, Laura nodded reluctantly. "Fine, but this isn't about us. It's about him." Evan joined the effort, using his connections to spread the word about the meeting. Over time, his sincerity began to chip away at Laura's guardedness. Seeing him read to Elliot or help with his school projects reminded her of the man she had once loved. The night of the meeting arrived, and the community center was packed. Parents, teachers, and local officials filled the room, their faces etched with worry and curiosity. Laura stood at the front, her heart pounding as she prepared to share her story. "Good evening," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "My name is Laura Bennett, and I'm here as both a mother and an advocate. What happened to my son Elliot was devastating, but it opened my eyes to a larger issue, one that affects many families in our community." She described her experience with Grace, the hidden camera footage, and the emotional toll it had taken on Elliot. As she spoke, the audience hung on her every word. She saw nods of recognition and heard murmurs of agreement. When Laura finished, Monroe took the stage, outlining the broader investigation. "This isn't an isolated incident," he said gravely. "We believe this network has been active for years, targeting families in neighborhoods like ours. But with your help, we can stop them." The meeting sparked a wave of action within the community. Parents began sharing their own stories, some of which revealed unsettling patterns of behavior from caregivers. Monroe and his team collected testimonies and evidence, building a stronger case against the network. Laura became a central figure in the movement, volunteering her time to raise awareness. She gave interviews, organized workshops, and worked with local organizations to provide resources for parents. One day, while preparing materials for a workshop, Laura received a message from a mother named Mariah Stu. It read, Thank you for sharing your story. Because of you, I found the courage to speak up. My daughter and I are finally getting the help we need." Laura's eyes filled with tears. Despite the pain and fear she had endured, she felt a profound sense of purpose. Meanwhile, Elliot continued to make strides in his healing journey. His sessions with Dr. Turner became a source of joy and creativity. One day, he came home holding a drawing of Braveheart, battling a shadowy monster. "Look, Mom," he said excitedly. "Braveheart won." Laura knelt down to examine the drawing, her heart swelling with pride. "You're so brave, Elliot, just like Braveheart." As they pinned the drawing to the refrigerator, Laura realized how far they had come. Elliot's resilience gave her hope, and her efforts to protect other families gave her strength. One evening, after a long day of meetings and therapy, Laura and Elliot sat on the couch, flipping through his favorite comic book. Evan joined them, bringing a bowl of popcorn. For the first time in months, the apartment felt like a home again. "Mom," Elliot said, snuggling against her side, "do you think we're superheroes?" Laura smiled, her eyes brimming with emotion. "Absolutely, sweetheart. The bravest ones I know." As they laughed and shared stories, Laura felt a sense of peace. The journey was far from over, but for the first time, she believed they would emerge stronger together. The day of the trial was etched in Laura's mind as a defining moment. For weeks, her thoughts had been consumed by preparations, meetings with lawyers, organizing evidence, and steadying Elliot for the emotional whirlwind to come. Now, as the courthouse loomed ahead, she gripped her son's hand tightly, silently promising him that this ordeal would bring them one step closer to justice. The courthouse was a stark building, its gray exterior reflecting the overcast sky. Inside, the atmosphere buzzed with tension. Reporters lined the hallways, murmuring among themselves, cameras clicking, as Laura, Elliot, and Detective Monroe arrived. Evan trailed slightly behind, carrying a briefcase with documents and support materials. "You ready for this?" Monroe asked, his voice calm but firm. Laura nodded, though her stomach churned. "As ready as I'll ever be." They entered the courtroom, where rows of seats were filled with onlookers, legal professionals, and a few familiar faces from Laura's support group. At the front of the room sat Grace Mitchell, her appearance unnervingly composed. She wore a conservative gray suit, her hair neatly tied back, and her expression unreadable. Laura's lawyer, Miriam Bell, a seasoned attorney with a fierce reputation, leaned over to her. "Remember, Laura, the truth is on our side. Let the evidence speak." The trial began with opening statements. The prosecutor painted a grim picture of Grace's actions, emphasizing the impact on Elliot's mental health. Grace's defense attorney, a slick man named Richard Hale, countered with an argument of misunderstanding and overreaction. Then came the moment Laura had been dreading, Elliot's testimony. "Elliot Bennett," the bailiff called. Laura felt her heart leap as her son, dressed in a small suit and holding a stuffed toy tucked discreetly under his arm, approached the witness stand. His steps were hesitant, his eyes scanning the room nervously. "You'll do great, sweetheart," Laura whispered to him as he passed. He nodded, barely meeting her gaze. Dr. Rachel Turner, who had worked with Elliot throughout his therapy, was allowed to accompany him, sitting a few feet away for reassurance. Elliot's small voice echoed in the silent room as he answered questions about his experiences with Grace. She said I was stupid," Elliot stammered, clutching the edge of the stand. "She made me stand in the corner for hours. I was scared." Richard Hale rose for the cross-examination. "Elliot, isn't it possible that Miss Mitchell was simply trying to discipline you? Maybe you misunderstood her intentions?" Elliot's eyes darted toward his mother, seeking reassurance. Laura's gaze met his, steady and supportive. "She wasn't nice," Elliot said, his voice trembling but firm. "She was mean. I know what mean is." The pivotal moment of the trial came when Miriam Bell introduced the hidden camera footage. The courtroom lights dimmed as the video played on a large screen. The first few minutes seemed mundane, Grace entering the apartment, tidying up. But then her true colors emerged. The audience gasped audibly as Grace's voice filled the room. "You clumsy little brat," she sneered at Elliot after he spilled juice. The footage showed her grabbing his arm roughly and forcing him into a corner. Laura couldn't bear to watch, her heart breaking anew as her son's suffering played out on the screen. She glanced at the jury, noting their shocked and appalled expressions. When the video ended, Miriam Bell addressed the court. "This isn't discipline. This is cruelty. And no child should ever endure this." Grace took the stand, maintaining her calm demeanor. "I care deeply for children," she said, her voice measured. "I may have been strict at times, but it was always for Elliot's benefit. Children need boundaries." Miriam's cross-examination, however, exposed glaring inconsistencies in Grace's statements. Documents were presented revealing fabricated references and a history of similar accusations in other cities. Grace's composed mask began to crack under the weight of mounting evidence. "Miss Mitchell," Miriam said, her tone sharp, "how do you explain the bruises on Elliot's arm?" Grace hesitated. "I don't recall. Perhaps he fell at school." Miriam leaned forward. "And the footage of you yanking his arm, was that for his benefit too?" Grace's silence was damning. When Laura took the stand, she spoke with raw emotion. She recounted the gradual changes in Elliot, the guilt she felt for not noticing sooner, and the steps she took to protect him. Once the truth emerged, "I trusted Grace Mitchell with my most precious treasure, my son," Laura said, her voice breaking. "She betrayed that trust in the worst possible way." As she stepped down, the courtroom was silent. Laura could feel the weight of her words lingering in the air. After hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. The foreman stood, holding a piece of paper that would decide the outcome. "On the charge of child abuse, we find the defendant, Grace Mitchell, guilty." Relief washed over Laura like a tidal wave. She glanced at Elliot, who was seated beside Evan, and saw a small smile break through his tense expression. The judge delivered the sentence: 5 years in prison, mandatory psychological evaluation, and restitution to the affected families. The decision felt just, though Laura knew it wouldn't erase the trauma. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed Laura for comments. She spoke briefly, emphasizing the importance of vigilance and community support. "This isn't just about my son," she said. "It's about protecting all children. We need to trust our instincts and stand up for those who can't stand up for themselves." The trial had a ripple effect throughout the community. Parents became more proactive in vetting caregivers, and several families came forward with their own stories. Monroe's investigation expanded, leading to the dismantling of more elements of the network Grace was connected to. At home, Laura and Elliot celebrated quietly with Evan. They ordered pizza, watched Elliot's favorite superhero movie, and laughed together for the first time in what felt like forever. "Mom," Elliot said, looking up at her with wide eyes, "does this mean the bad lady won't come back?" Laura knelt beside him, holding his hands. "That's right, sweetheart. She's gone, and she can't hurt you or anyone else ever again." That night, as Laura tucked Elliot into bed, he reached for his stuffed toy and hugged it tightly. "You were really brave today," Laura whispered, brushing his hair back. "So were you, Mom," Elliot replied, his voice soft but steady. As Laura turned off the light, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in months. They still had a long road ahead, but together, they had taken a significant step toward healing. The days following the trial felt surreal to Laura. The courtroom drama had left a mark on her, but with Grace behind bars, she could finally breathe. More than that, she could now focus entirely on Elliot, on helping him heal and reclaiming the vibrant boy he had been before Grace entered their lives. The moving truck rumbled to a stop outside a modest but charming two-bedroom apartment on the quieter side of Chicago. The building was a step up from their old place, a brighter, more cheerful environment, with a small park nearby where children played. Laura felt a swell of hope as she opened the door to their new home. "Elliot, come see," she called. Elliot peered from behind her, clutching his favorite stuffed animal. His eyes widened as he took in the bright living room and the large windows that let in streams of sunlight. "This is our new house?" he asked, his voice tentative. Laura crouched beside him, smiling. "It is, sweetheart. It's our fresh start." Elliot wandered into the room, his fingers brushing against the walls. "It feels happy," he said softly. Laura's heart ached and soared simultaneously. She ruffled his hair. "That's because it's our happy place now." The movers brought in boxes, and Laura and Elliot spent the day unpacking. They decided to decorate Elliot's room first. Together, they put up posters of his favorite superheroes and strung twinkling fairy lights across the ceiling. "Do you like it?" Laura asked after they finished. Elliot surveyed the room, his expression transforming into a shy smile. "It's awesome." Laura made a conscious effort to balance work and time with Elliot. She'd requested reduced hours at the hospital, knowing she couldn't afford to miss more moments with her son. Her boss, understanding the situation, had agreed. Each morning, they established a new ritual, making pancakes together in the kitchen. Elliot, perched on a stool, took great pride in flipping them. "Perfect pancake coming up," he exclaimed one morning, sliding a golden brown pancake onto a plate. "Chef Elliot, you've outdone yourself," Laura teased, adding syrup to the plate. These small moments of connection helped rebuild the trust that had been shaken. Laura could see the change in Elliot's demeanor. He laughed more, talked more, and even began sleeping through the night without waking from nightmares. One evening, Laura surprised Elliot with a special gift. She handed him a neatly wrapped package, her heart fluttering with anticipation. "What is it?" Elliot asked, his curiosity piqued. "Open it and see," Laura said, sitting beside him on the couch. Elliot tore the wrapping paper carefully. Inside was a bright red cape, shimmering with golden trim. In the center was a bold yellow letter. "It's your superhero cape," Laura explained. "Because you're the bravest boy I know." Elliot's eyes lit up as he held the cape. "For real?" "For real," Laura said, fastening it around his shoulders. "This is to remind you that you're strong, no matter what." Elliot leapt off the couch, spinning around as the cape fluttered behind him. "I'm Super Elliot," he declared, striking a heroic pose. Laura clapped, her laughter ringing out. "And Super Elliot saves the day again." With Elliot's encouragement, Laura continued attending her parents' support group meetings. She found solace in sharing her story and listening to others. The group even organized a picnic for families, inviting children who had experienced similar traumas. At the picnic, Elliot met other kids his age. Initially shy, he clung to Laura's side, but gradually he joined in on a game of tag. By the end of the day, he was laughing and chasing new friends around the park. "Look at him," a fellow parent said to Laura. "He's come so far." Laura nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. He really has. Evan, too, played a part in their healing journey. Though Laura had been wary of his reappearance, she was surprised by his sincerity. He showed up for Elliot consistently, helping with school projects, taking him to the park, and even attending therapy sessions with Dr. Turner. One evening, after Elliot had gone to bed, Evan and Laura sat on the porch of their new apartment. The city lights twinkled in the distance. "I know I wasn't there for you both before," Evan said, breaking the silence, "but I want to be now." Laura sipped her tea, considering his words. "It's not about words, Evan. It's about showing up, and you're doing that. For Elliot's sake, I hope you keep it up." Evan nodded solemnly. "I will." Though Laura wasn't sure they'd ever fully reconcile, she appreciated his efforts to mend the relationship for their son's sake. With time and therapy, Elliot's confidence blossomed. He began drawing again, creating vivid illustrations of superheroes. Each character had a unique backstory, and Elliot eagerly shared them with Laura. "This one," he said one afternoon, holding up a drawing of a superhero with a red cape, "is Captain Courage. He helps kids when they're scared." Laura hugged him tightly. "I think Captain Courage is my favorite." Elliot grinned. "Mine too." One rainy evening, as Laura tucked Elliot into bed, he looked up at her with serious eyes. "Mom?" "Yes, sweetheart. Do you think Grace will ever hurt anyone again?" Laura's heart clenched, but she smiled softly. "No, honey. She's gone, and she can't hurt anyone anymore." Elliot nodded, snuggling into his pillow. "Good. I don't want any other kids to feel like I did." Laura kissed his forehead. "You're my hero, Elliot. Always remember that." The following weekend, Laura and Elliot hosted a housewarming party. Friends and family filled the apartment, their laughter and joy infusing the space with warmth. Elliot proudly wore his superhero cape, showing off his room to everyone who visited. As the evening wound down, Laura watched Elliot play with his friends, his laughter filling the air. She felt a profound sense of gratitude. They had faced unimaginable darkness, but they had emerged stronger and closer than ever. Laura made a silent vow to herself. No matter what challenges lay ahead, she and Elliot would face them together side by side. The gentle hum of morning filled Laura's apartment as sunlight filtered through the windows. The walls, now adorned with Elliot's superhero drawings, told the story of resilience and hope. This day, however, promised to be more than just another step in their healing journey. It was a celebration of how far they had come. "Mom, do you think people will clap for me?" Elliot asked, his voice filled with a mix of excitement and apprehension. He stood in his bedroom, staring at his bright red superhero cape hanging on the back of his chair. Laura knelt down to his level, smoothing out the wrinkles on his cape. "Sweetheart, they're not just going to clap for you. They're going to cheer so loud you might think you're flying." Elliot grinned, but then hesitated. What if they don't think I'm brave enough?" Laura cupped his face, looking into his big, questioning eyes. "Elliot Bennett, you stood up to something so scary and told the truth when it mattered most. That's the bravest thing anyone can do. You're a hero, not just to me, but to so many others." With that reassurance, Elliot stood a little taller. He slipped into his cape, fastening it securely at his neck. "Okay," he said with determination. "I'm ready." The town square buzzed with life as families gathered for Heroes Day, an event organized by the community to honor resilience and bravery. Colorful banners swayed in the breeze, and balloons of every hue floated against the clear blue sky. A makeshift stage stood at the center, flanked by rows of chairs filled with smiling faces. Laura and Elliot arrived early, greeted warmly by neighbors and friends who had followed their story. A group of children waved Elliot over, and after a glance at his mom for reassurance, he ran to join them. Laura felt a tap on her shoulder. Turning around, she saw Detective Jordan Monroe, a kind smile on his face. "Big day for you both," he said. Laura nodded, her eyes misty. "It's hard to believe we're here." Detective Monroe placed a hand on her shoulder. "You both deserve this. You turned a dark moment into something that's going to help a lot of people." As the event began, the MC, a charismatic local radio host, took to the stage, his voice booming through the microphone. "Today, we honor the heroes among us, people who've shown courage in the face of adversity. And there's one special hero we're all here to celebrate today." Laura's heart swelled with pride as the MC continued. "Elliot Bennett, an 8-year-old who stood up to injustice and inspired a community. Please join us on stage." The crowd erupted in applause, and Laura nudged Elliot forward. His cape billowed behind him as he walked to the stage, his face a mix of nervousness and excitement. As Elliot reached the microphone, the MC crouched to his level. "Elliot, can you tell us what being a hero means to you?" Elliot glanced at the crowd, then at his mom. With a deep breath, he said, "Being a hero means telling the truth, even when it's scary. And it means helping people who need you." The audience roared with approval, and Elliot beamed. The MC handed him a medal, a golden star on a red ribbon, which Elliot accepted with wide eyes and a proud smile. After the ceremony, Laura found herself surrounded by other parents, many of whom shared their gratitude. "Your story gave me the courage to speak up," one mother said, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." Laura squeezed the woman's hand. "We're stronger when we stand together." Nearby, Elliot was showing his medal to his new friends, his laughter ringing through the air. Laura couldn't help but marvel at the transformation in her son. The shy, withdrawn boy she'd once worried over had become a beacon of hope and resilience. As the sun dipped lower in the skies, the event shifted into a lively picnic. Families spread out blankets, sharing food and stories. A group of children, including Elliot, organized a game of tag, their carefree laughter echoing through the square. Detective Monroe approached Laura once more. "The work you've done with the community has been incredible. We're seeing more people come forward and more awareness about protecting vulnerable children." Laura smiled. "If sharing our story can help even one family avoid what we went through, it's worth it." Later that evening, Laura and Elliot returned home, their hearts full from the day's events. Elliot clutched his medal as if it were a treasure. "Mom," he said, as they sat on the couch, "do you think Grace will ever be nice to people?" Laura considered the question carefully. "I think she has a lot to learn about kindness. But what matters most is that you showed her and the world that hurting people is never okay." Elliot nodded, seemingly satisfied. He leaned against her, and they sat in comfortable silence, watching the city lights twinkle outside their window. As Laura tucked Elliot into bed that night, he reached for her hand. "Mom, today was the best day ever." Laura kissed his forehead. "You're my hero, Elliot, and I'm so proud of you." Elliot smiled sleepily. "Love you, Mom." "Love you more," Laura whispered, turning off the light. As she closed the door to Elliot's room, Laura felt an overwhelming sense of peace. Their journey had been long and fraught with challenges, but they had emerged stronger, their bond unbreakable. Laura knew that together they could face anything the future held. And for the first time in a long time, she looked forward to what was to come, with hope, love, and unwavering strength. As we close this chapter of Laura and Elliot's incredible journey, we're reminded of the power of courage, resilience, and the bonds that hold us together through even the darkest times. Their story isn't just about overcoming, it's about rising, about inspiring us to be braver, kinder, and stronger in the face of challenges. Now, I'd love to hear from you. What part of this story moved you the most? Was it Elliot's unshakable bravery, Laura's fierce love as a mother, or the strength of a community coming together? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective matters, and I'd love to know what resonated with you. And if this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next inspiring tale. There's so much more to come. Stories of hope, love, and the resilience of the human spirit. Hit the bell icon to be the first to know when a new story drops. Thank you for being a part of this journey. Together, we can find hope in every story and strength in every challenge. See you in the next one, Star.